American cars failed in Europe, and not just by a little. We're talking total flops. Loud, overpriced, unreliable machines that couldn't survive European roads, wallets, or expectations. Some didn't even last 2 years. And guess what? These disasters weren't from unknown brands. They were supposed to be icons. Today, we're exposing the 10 worst American cars that Europe flat out rejected. Starting with number 10, the Chevrolet Corvette has ruled American roads for decades. Its loud V8, sharp design, and racing history made it a pride of US highways. So when the C7 version arrived between 2014 and 2019, many thought it would finally win over European buyers too, but things didn't go as planned. Even with its aggressive styling and thrilling performance, the Corvette never really found a home in Europe. At best, it sold around 700 units per year across the entire continent. That's nothing compared to the nearly 20,000 it sold annually in the US. It just didn't click with the European crowd. There were a few reasons why. First, European drivers are fiercely loyal to their own sports cars. Porsche dominates the scene. When buyers are already hooked on German precision and Italian flair, a Chevy badge doesn't exactly scream high-end appeal, especially not at a six-figure price. Then there's the engine. The Corvette's power is undeniable, but its thirst for petrol and high CO2 emissions meant massive taxes and running costs across Europe. For many, it just wasn't worth it. Even though the C7 was a big step forward in handling, European critics still picked apart the interior. It felt cheap compared to rivals. German and Italian sports cars offered more refinement, better materials, and a sense of class the Corvette couldn't match. So while the Corvette brought plenty of power, what it lacked was elegance, and that's what left it in the dust on European roads. But if the Corvette couldn't win over Europe, what hope did its brawnier cousin have? At number 9, the Chevrolet Camaro had all the right ingredients for excitement: loud engine, big power, and aggressive looks. When Chevy brought it to Europe in the early 2010s, there was real hope that it would carve out a space among European drivers. At first, it looked promising. In 2012, around 2,200 units were sold across the continent, but that spark didn't last. Just 3 years later, that number dropped to only 367, and by 2022, only 25 Camaros were sold in all of Europe. So what went wrong? The problem stacked up quickly. Most versions only came in left-hand drive, which already ruled out a lot of buyers. Then came the fuel costs. The Camaro's 6.2-litre V8 drank petrol like water, and with prices over £1.50 per litre, running one daily just didn't make sense. High CO2 taxes made things even worse, and while it looked great on a poster, the car didn't really suit European roads. It was wide, hard to park, and had poor visibility. The interior didn't help either. It felt cheap compared to what you'd find in an Audi or BMW. Sure, some enthusiasts loved it. The sound, the power, the attitude, it all clicked for a certain crowd, but they were few. For most drivers, it was just too impractical. By the time Chevrolet pulled most of its lineup from Europe, the Camaro's fate was sealed. It had arrived with fanfare but faded into the background fast, kept alive only by die-hard fans and the occasional car meet appearance. And if a flashy muscle car couldn't survive the European streets, just imagine how a full-blown Hummer tried to fit in. At number 8, the Hummer H3 was big, loud, and full of attitude. It was built to look tough, drive through mud, and turn heads. In America, that worked. Celebrities like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Mike Tyson proudly drove it. People loved its bold look and military roots, but in Europe it flopped completely. Over its entire production run from 2007 to 2010, only about 2,500 H3s were sold in all of Europe. That's not per year, that's total. And once you understand why, it's not hard to see the problem. First, the size. At 2.1 meters wide and weighing over 2.3 tons, it was like driving a tank through tiny cobblestone streets. It barely fit in car parks, couldn't squeeze down narrow lanes, and looked ridiculous next to tiny hatchbacks. For most Europeans, it was simply too much car. Then there was the engine. The H3 came with a 5-cylinder petrol engine that drank fuel like it was free. On a good day, it managed just 14 miles per gallon. And unlike other SUVs in Europe, there was no diesel option. That mattered a lot. Diesel engines were still popular at the time because they offered better fuel economy and lower emissions. Without one, the H3 didn't stand a chance. Timing made things even worse. It launched just as petrol prices were spiking across Europe and the EU started cracking down on high-emissions vehicles. Drivers didn't just dislike gas guzzlers, they were being taxed for owning them. Inside, the H3 felt like a military vehicle. Not in a cool way though. It had hard plastics, low quality finishes, and very little comfort. It was more like sitting in a barracks than a car designed for everyday life. By 2010, it was over. Hummer as a brand shut down. European dealers were stuck with massive SUVs nobody wanted. The H3 became a running joke, proof that American car makers didn't understand what Europeans needed or wanted. It was loud, heavy, inefficient, and completely out of place. At number 7, Chrysler thought it had a global winner with the Dodge Caliber. It looked like a mini SUV but was really just a compact hatchback, dressed up to catch the eye. On paper, it ticked all the right boxes for Europe. It had a low price, it came with a diesel option, and it promised the tough American styling that might stand out on tight European streets. But everything started falling apart once people actually drove it. European reviewers tore into it. The handling felt rough and unrefined. The ride was bouncy and uncomfortable. And the interior? It was full of hard, cheap plastic that looked and felt awful. It didn't help that Dodge added silly gimmicks like glowing cup holders or a flip-down boot stereo, which only made it seem more desperate. And then came the real killer: reliability. The CVT automatic gearbox wasn't just dull, it was noisy, sluggish, and known to fail. Drivers started complaining, and the word spread fast. In its full year, Dodge sold over 17,000 units across Europe, but by 2011, that number had collapsed to under 1,000. It wasn't just slipping, it was sinking. European buyers had already made up their minds. The Caliber was no match for the Volkswagen Golf or even cheaper European rivals. The handling wasn't sharp, the engines weren't efficient, and the overall quality? It felt like a rental car you couldn't wait to return. By the time Dodge pulled the plug on its European operations in 2011, the Caliber was already a punchline. People laughed at how bad it was. It became the example everyone pointed to when they talked about Detroit not understanding the European market. Aggressive looks couldn't hide poor engineering, and Europe was not falling for it. At number 6, the Ford Edge was supposed to be Ford's big luxury SUV for Europe. It came from America looking bold, loaded with features and dressed to impress. Ford didn't even bother offering the basic versions. Only top trims made it across the Atlantic, and they weren't cheap. In the UK, the Edge started from around £37,000. That was nearly 50% more than what Americans paid for the same car. Ford believed European drivers would pay extra for big space, diesel engines, and soft seats. At first, it seemed to work. In 2017, over 4,000 units were sold in the UK, but then reality kicked in. Sales dropped sharply the next year, with less than half that number sold in 2018. By 2019, Ford pulled the plug in the UK. The Edge disappeared quietly, later restricted to just a few European countries where it still struggled. So what went wrong? For starters, Europeans weren't interested in paying luxury money for a Ford. Yes, the Edge was spacious and comfortable, but it felt heavy and dull on the road. Its 2-liter diesel struggled to move its bulk with any excitement, and it wasn't alone in the market. The SUV segment in Europe was already packed. Buyers had plenty of choices: BMW X3, Audi Q5, Volvo XC60, all offering stronger performance, better brand appeal, and just as many gadgets. Even inside Ford's own lineup, the Edge had competition. The Kuga was cheaper and more suited to European roads. The smaller Puma crossover was coming soon, aimed at younger drivers, so the Edge didn't really fit in anywhere. It wasn't luxurious enough to compete with premium brands, and it was too expensive to feel like a good deal under the Ford badge. In the end, it just didn't connect with European buyers. Ford seemed to misread the room entirely. They brought in a car that tried to be something it wasn't. By 2021, unsold Edges were finally cleared from lots. The car had come in loud and proud, but left with barely a whisper. At number 5, Chevrolet had high hopes when they brought the Malibu to Europe in 2012. It was supposed to be their top sedan, a rebadged Opel ready to take on big names like the Ford Mondeo and Volkswagen Passat. They pushed the Malibu hard, calling it spacious and affordable. But most people didn't even notice, and the ones who did weren't impressed. The engines were weak, especially the petrol ones. Worse, there was no diesel version at launch. A huge mistake in a market where diesel was still king. Reviewers didn't hold back. They called the design boring and the interior outdated. It looked like something from a few years earlier, not a fresh contender. Sales were slow from the start. In its first full year, Chevrolet sold only about 2,179 units across all of Europe. Yep, you heard that right. Meanwhile, Ford and VW were selling tens of thousands of mid-sized sedans without even trying. By 2014, things got even worse. With Chevrolet already preparing to leave the European market, Malibu sales dropped to a shocking 334 cars. That's barely one car per day across the entire continent. No one wanted to buy a car from a brand that was already on its way out. And even if they did, they faced another problem. Parts were hard to find and resale value was awful. GM made the call in late 2013 to pull almost all Chevrolet models from Europe by 2015, except for the Camaro and the Corvette. The Malibu didn't stand a chance. Those who bought it likely did so at a massive discount, but the savings didn't last long. Repairs were costly, support was limited, and the car's value dropped like a rock. It didn't matter that the Malibu was meant to be practical. It simply wasn't built for Europe, and no one cared to make it work. In the end, the Malibu became a warning sign, a reminder that you can't just rebadge a car, drop it in Europe and expect it to compete. It disappeared from roads almost as quickly as it came, leaving behind empty showrooms and forgotten brochures. And number 4, the Cadillac Escalade was never going to have an easy ride in Europe. With its massive chrome grille, roaring V8 engine and bold American styling, it looked like something out of a music video, not a practical daily driver for the average European. Back in the US, it was a statement of wealth and flash, a vehicle people used to turn heads, but across the Atlantic, it turned heads for all the wrong reasons. General Motors still gave it a shot. They brought the 4th generation Escalade to Europe, hoping that it would appeal to the niche crowd, rich buyers who didn't want to drive what everyone else was driving. But there was problems right from the start. First, the Cadillac badge meant very little in Europe. Unlike BMW or Mercedes, Cadillac had no real history, no strong reputation. For most people, it felt like a flashy off-brand trying to play in a premium league it didn't belong to. Second, the Escalade was just too big. Over 5.1 meters long and 2 meters wide, it made tight city streets and narrow car parks a nightmare. It wasn't built for cobblestones or tiny roundabouts. And to that huge 6.2-liter petrol V8, later followed by a smaller diesel that still felt out of place. And you had a vehicle that drank fuel like it was free. In a continent obsessed with efficiency and emissions, that alone was enough to put off most buyers. And the numbers? They were brutal. In some years, fewer than 100 Escalades were sold across the entire continent. In 2014, just 62 units were sold. Even in its best year, in 2018, it managed only 413 sales in all of Europe. Compare that to around 25,000 units sold in the US during the same year. That's no slump, that's a total rejection. Reviews didn't save it either. European critics slammed the handling, calling it soft and clumsy. They didn't like the design either. It felt too loud, too brash. Even the interior, packed with features, couldn't compete with the clean, refined feel of a Range Rover or Audi. It looked expensive but didn't feel worth the money. In the end, the Escalade never really had a chance. The size, the fuel use, the unknown brand, all of it worked against it. You might still catch one in London or Moscow, driven by someone with a taste for something different, but for most Europeans, the Escalade is something you see in rap videos or Hollywood films, not on real roads. It was a symbol of American excess that just didn't fit into the European mindset. At number 3, Cadillac ATS was supposed to be a big move. It had been tested on Nürburgring. It handled well. It felt sporty. In the US, critics liked it, but in Europe, no one cared. One major problem? It had no diesel engine. That alone made it a non-starter for most European buyers. On top of that, there was no manual gearbox at launch, and there were barely any dealerships. You can't sell what people can't find. In its launch year, Cadillac sold just 200 cars in all of Europe, across all models. That's not just bad, that's invisible. Even when Cadillac improved its lineup globally, European buyers stayed cold. Sales stayed in the low hundreds per year. Most luxury car buyers didn't even know the ATS existed. And if they did, they had nowhere to test drive it. The lucky few who got behind the wheel discovered something strange. The chassis felt good, but the rear seats were tight, and the interior felt outdated compared to German rivals. Worse, the ATS wasn't cheap. Cadillac priced it close to BMW and Audi. That made people laugh. Why would anyone pay BMW money for a car with no reputation, no diesel, and no dealer support? Fleet buyers didn't touch it either. And in this part of the market, fleets are key. Without them, you're done before you begin. By 2018, the ATS was gone, quietly withdrawn. It had never taken off. Cadillac's broader strategy didn't help either. In 2015, GM pulled Chevrolet from Europe to focus on Opel and Cadillac, but in 2017 they sold Opel. That left Cadillac in the middle of nowhere. No network, no local support, no plan. The ATS never stood a chance. It entered a tough market with the wrong tools and no backup. Some called it brave, others called it foolish. One analyst summed it up best: Cadillac trying to beat BMW in Europe was like taking on the Romans in Rome. At number 2, when Jeep launched the 5th generation Cherokee in 2014, it expected to make a splash in Europe. The brand already had a reputation for ruggedness, and SUVs were getting more popular by the day. On paper, it should have worked, but this version of the Cherokee took a direction that few expected, and even fewer liked. The front end was the first red flag. Instead of Jeep's usual boxy and muscular look, the Cherokee showed up with thin LED strips above the main headlight. The setup made it look more like a sci-fi creature than an off-road machine. Many compared it to an alien face. That design decision alone turned off thousands of loyal Jeep fans, but looks weren't the only issue. Under the surface, things got worse. Jeep fitted the Cherokee with a 9-speed automatic gearbox that was supposed to improve performance and fuel efficiency. Instead, it became one of the model's biggest headaches. Drivers complained about jerky shifts and clunky behavior. The software controlling the transmission was buggy, which led to multiple recalls. For a company already struggling with its reputation for reliability, this was a disaster. In fact, a 2018 UK survey placed Jeep as the second worst car brand for dependability. European buyers had plenty of SUV options. To compete, a new model had to offer something special, but the Cherokee didn't know what it wanted to be. It wasn't rugged enough for hardcore off-road fans. It wasn't smooth or economical enough for city drivers. That confusion didn't go unnoticed. In 2015, Jeep managed to sell around 12,000 Cherokees in Europe. That wasn't bad, but by 2017, sales had dropped to around 5,500 units. That sharp decline told the whole story. Drivers were choosing other brands that were either more luxurious, more efficient, or simply more reliable. Fuel economy was average at best, the interior didn't feel premium, and when you added the options needed to match the feature of rivals, the price shot up quickly. Suddenly, you were paying a premium for a car that didn't feel premium. To make matters worse, Jeep's image took another hit when its bigger model, the Grand Cherokee, was caught up in a diesel emissions scandal. It violated EU regulations and risked being banned from sale unless changes were made. That scandal cast a shadow over the entire brand in Europe. By 2018, Jeep tried to fix the damage. The Cherokee got a facelift with more conventional styling and updated tech, but it was too late. The car's reputation was already ruined. Buyers had moved on. Other Jeep models like the Renegade and Compass managed to do well, but the Cherokee was a clear misfire. At number 1, it was supposed to be a bold comeback. In 2011, Fiat made a surprising move. They took the Chrysler 300C from America, slapped a Lancia badge on it and tried to sell it as the Lancia Thema across Europe. The UK kept the original name, calling it the Chrysler 300C, but the rest of the continent got this strange Italian-American hybrid. On paper, it seemed promising. The car was big, packed with features, and came with a strong V6 diesel option that Europeans might have liked. Fiat was confident, maybe too confident. They set a sales goal of 10,000 units per year. That goal was never close. In 2012, they only managed to sell 2,000 cars in all of Europe. Things picked up a little in 2013, hitting a peak of 2,457 units, but that was the high point. By 2014, only 480 were sold, and in 2015, just 38. Not even 50 across the entire continent. It was a disaster. In Lancia's own home country, Italy, the Thema couldn't even reach 1,000 sales. In Germany, the most competitive luxury sedan market in Europe, it didn't even make a dent. The Thema captured only 0.1% of the E segment. That's not just low, it's invisible. So what went wrong? First, the car didn't even feel like a Lancia. Lancia fans were used to sleek, graceful Italian saloons. What they got instead was a bulky American bruiser with some extra leather and wood trim. It looked like a muscle car wearing a tuxedo, and no one was fooled. The design was already dated by European standards. Underneath, it was still based on a 2005 platform. It drove like it too. Heavy, a bit clumsy, and far less refined than what Mercedes, BMW, or Jaguar were offering at the time. Buyers in Europe expect a luxury car to feel precise, quiet, and modern. The Thema did not deliver. Its size didn't help either. It was too big for narrow city streets and didn't offer anything unique to tempt drivers away from the German brands that they already trusted. Then there was the issue of the after-sales support. Many Chrysler dealerships had shut down, and Fiat dealers didn't want to deal with an awkward American rebadge. Servicing the Thema became a hassle. Resale values collapsed. Fleets and company car buyers, who usually help keep executive sedans alive, stayed far away. The result was clear. The Lancia Thema flopped hard, selling just a fifth of its already modest target. Fiat quietly killed it in 2015. Not long after, Lancia stopped selling cars outside Italy entirely.